They came before Columbus, the African presence in ancient America, by Ivan van Sertima. Chapter 7: Black Africa and Egypt. What was most characteristic in the pre-dynastic culture of Egypt is due to intercourse with the interior of Africa and the immediate influence of that permanent Negro element which had been present in the population of southern Egypt from the remotest times to our day. Randall McIver, Ancient Races of the Thebaid. Egypt was the receiver still more than the giver. Ancient Egypt was essentially an African colonization. Basil Davidson, The African Past. If you could stand on the summit of the Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza, looking south, you would feel your spirit walking down a street that took you back to the beginnings of man's longest civilization. As far as you could see on the southern horizon would lie the conical tents of the gods, pitched upon the earth for more than 60 miles, pyramid after pyramid, row after row of royal tombs, skyscrapers of sheer stone, the blocks of which, if laid end to end, would circle the belly of the world. You could descend and walk unannounced into this city of the dead, for the doors of the tombs are standing open. When Count Volney stood under the shadow of the Great Sphinx in 1783 and looked at these man-made mountains stretching across the western desert, he was startled and confused. He had walked across the low flat country, dotted with villages of mud brick huts, where stood the tall date palms. The floor of the land was a vivid green, and through the green ran an intricate network of irrigation canals. Brown and black-skinned men of slender build and dark hair, mostly Negroid, quote, having a broad and flat nose, very short, a large flattened mouth, thick lips, end quote, were seen along the banks of the canals, swaying up and down as they rhythmically lifted irrigation buckets attached to what looked like a well sweep. These men were native Egyptians, with skins and features like many of the slaves of the French Empire. How could things have been turned so upside down? How could history have been so violently reversed? A strange guilt troubled Count Volney. It was so natural to think of blacks as, quote, hewers of wood and drawers of water, end quote. When did this curse begin? How we are astonished, he later wrote, quote, when we reflect that to the race of Negroes, at present our slaves, and the objects of our content, we owe our arts, sciences, end quote. 15 years later, an expedition under Napoleon marched into Egypt. The scientists of that expedition were equally astonished and impressed. From what they saw, they concluded, as the Greeks had done 1,000 years before, that Egyptian civilization owed its inspiration to a black race. This rediscovery by Europeans of ancient Egypt and the disclosures of a powerful Negro-African element in the ancestry of a civilization to which Europe owed so much came as an embarrassment. It came also at a most inopportune time. It threatened to explode a myth of innate black inferiority that was necessary to the peace of the Christian conscience in a Europe that was then prospering from the massive exploitation of black slaves. Africa was being systematically depopulated. Its empires had disintegrated. Its history had been buried. Its movement in step with other world civilizations had been abruptly halted. Only its most backward and inaccessible elements were left virtually untouched to bear false witness in later times to the scale and complexity of its evolution. The Christian conscience of slave-trading Europe had been assuaged for a while by a myth which drew its inspiration not from the Christian Bible, as some theologians of the day then thought, for the Bible makes no distinctions between black and white, but from a very arbitrary interpretation of a biblical story, the story of Ham, which appeared in the Talmud, a collection of Jewish oral traditions in the 6th century A.D., starting out as an innocuous little anecdote. Noah curses a son of Ham, making him and his progeny, quote, a servant of servants, end quote, for looking at him in his nakedness. It grew to become a most pernicious racial myth. It has affected nearly all histories of Africa and Africans for the past 200 years. The curse of the son of Ham, it was said, was the curse of blackness. The descendants of the son of Ham, according to this interpretation of the story, were the Africans and the Egyptians, who, at the time the myth began to circulate, had fallen from their pinnacle of power. When, however, the Napoleonic expedition uncovered the splendors of ancient Egyptian civilization, a new version of history was urgently required. The myth of blackness as a curse had backfired. How could a black and accursed race have inspired or contributed greatly to the development of a pre-European civilization? An ingenious new version was not long in the making. Political necessity, then as now, is the mother of historical invention. Christian theologians began to suggest that Noah had cursed only Canaan, one son of Ham, and that therefore the curse lay only on his progeny, the black race. Another son of Ham, Mizraim, had not been cursed. From him issued the marvelous Egyptians, the creators of the greatest of early civilizations. The Christian conscience could sleep peacefully again. Canaan's sons, after all, the black branch, were only getting what was their terrible destiny and due. The sons of Mizraim were the Caucasoid, curse-free branch of the Hamites, according to this new version. With the creation of these two legendary branches, a servile and accursed Negroid branch, and a gifted and blessed Caucasoid branch, the problem of the Hamitic curse was neatly solved. From then on, historians and anthropologists would talk of Hamitic culture bringers in Africa, meaning whites, fairy grandfathers, touching the Kemai, the original word for Egypt, literally the black lands, with the magical wand of civilization. Behind the van of the clergy, to assist and consolidate this version, rose up a scientific establishment that tried to prove that Negro Africans had nothing whatever to do with the evolution and development of Egyptian civilization. Skeletal material from Egypt was selectively gathered and selectively measured and classified. The American anatomist Samuel Morton, the Shockley of the 19th century, using pseudo-scientific criteria, flattered and delighted his negrophobic listeners by demonstrating to their satisfaction that the Egyptians were a Caucasoid race and indigenous to the Nile Valley. This finding flatly contradicted the claim of the historian Herodotus that the Egyptians, compared to the Greeks and other European Caucasoid, were, for the most part, a black-skinned and woolly-haired people. The findings of Morton had been shown to be false. Extensive skeletal surveys of the ancient Egyptians, both before and during the dynasties, show them to be of roughly the same racial composition as the blacks of a modern Caribbean island, with a predominantly Negroid base and traces of Asiatic and Caucasoid admixtures. As Basil Davidson had pointed out in Africa in History, quote, "It now seems perfectly clear that the vast majority of pre-dynastic Egyptians were of continental African stock, and even of Central West Saharan origins." End quote. These people later mixed with the Asians and Caucasians migrating into the north of Egypt. The Nile was the meeting place of races, but the Negro-African element, both before and during several of the dynasties, was a dominant racial element. An Oxford professor of anatomy, Arthur Thompson, and an Egyptologist of the same university, David Randall McIver, carried out the most extensive surveys of ancient Egyptian skeletal material ever made. They reported in 1905 that from the early pre-dynastic period to the 5th dynasty, 24% of the males and 19.5% of the females were pure Negro. Between the 6th and the 18th dynasties, about 20% of the males and 15% of the females were pure Negro. An even larger percentage were, quote, intermediates, end quote, with Negroid physical characteristics. But the density of the Negro-African racial presence in pre-dynastic and dynastic Egypt is an empty statistic in itself. What should most concern us is the contribution of black Africans to the birth of Egyptian civilization, their participation in the growth and development of that civilization, and the eventual emergence toward the close of the dynasties of a black power, the Nubians, from a land south of the Negroid and mulatto Egyptians, as the source of both spiritual and political authority in the Egyptian world during the significant 800 to 700 BC New World, Old World contact period. Black Africa's influence upon the genesis of Egyptian civilization was profound. What came up to Egypt from south and west of the Nile was seminal. In the early formative centuries, the Sahara did not divide the African continent. Far from being a natural barrier between the peoples of West Africa and North Africa, Basil Davidson has pointed out, quote, "The old Sahara joined these peoples together. All could share in the same ideas and discoveries. Many travelers journeyed through the Green Sahara in New Stone Age times. They used horses and carts that have been found along two main trails between North and West Africa. New ideas were being taken back and forth by these old travelers. We shall make little sense of African history unless we have this picture constantly in mind. This picture of the great regions learning from each other, teaching each other, trading with each other through the centuries." End quote. But in this cultural give and take, what did the black African outside of Egypt really give that was so crucial to the foundations of Egyptian civilization? Recent archaeological studies in the Sahara and the Sudan have shown that much of the art one finds in the tombs of the pharaohs, many of the bird and animal deities the ancient Egyptians worshipped, and the custom and technique of mummification itself originated among Negro Africans south and west of the Nile. It has always been assumed that mummification originated in Egypt. There is evidence to show that it was practiced there as early as the Second Dynasty, circa 3000 BC. Since J. E. Bell found at Saqqara several tombs of this date in which the bodies have been elaborately bandaged, the limbs being wrapped separately. From the beginning of the 4th Dynasty, 2900 to 2750 BC, there is the canopic box of Hetephenes, mother of Cheops, the builder of the Great Pyramid at Giza, which still contains packets of what presumably were the viscera prescribed in a dilute of nacron, a chemical used in embalming, which is proof that the body has been embalmed, though the mummy was not in the tomb. There is an Egyptian mummy on display in the Museum of the Royal College of Surgeons in London that dates back to the 5th Dynasty, 2750 to 2475 BC. But going back to centuries earlier than the earliest of these Egyptian mummies is a recent find in the rocky hills of the Fezzan, the body of a Negroid child, mummified, flexed, and buried beneath the dirt floor of the family shelter. The body was carefully preserved, in this case by drying before burial. The discoverer, Italian archaeologist F. Mori, claims a date of 3500 BC for his find, and the carbon-14 dates back him up. The spectacular thing about that date is that it makes the Fezzan mummy older than the oldest known Egyptian mummies. There is one thing more. On the wall of the rock shelter in which the child was buried, someone had painted a mummy figure bound in many cloths and tied with bands. This is the way the dead were represented in Egypt in latter times. And yet, Dr. Mori believes the painting may date even further back than the child's burial. Another blow to the Egyptian image, to her reputation as premier undertaker. The implications of this go beyond mere burial practices. Mummification in dynastic Egypt was part of a complex body of ritual and belief. The concept of the king as divine, as a god in person among men, lay at the root of royal mummification. The particular form of this divine kingship found in Egypt came not from Asia, as was formerly supposed, but from the heart of Africa. Egyptian ideas of kingship, Bohannon and Curtin have pointed out, developed in Egypt itself and were developed on an African cultural base. The ideas about the nature of the dead were expressed in the pyramids, which ideas developed with amazing rapidity once they started. And the forms of the state that emerged are significantly different from similar ideas and practices found in Asia Minor. Divine kingship seems to have been an African invention, for the African forms differ radically from the other. Millennia later, it could be found in Uganda, in the Benue Valley, along the Guinea coast, and down into Rhodesia. Prototypes of some of the bird and animal deities of the Egyptians have been traced back to the desert rock art of Negro Africans in the Tassili Mountains. Even the ceremonial costumes of the pharaohs blossomed out of sartorial styles displayed by some figures on these rocks. Anthropologist Henry Lotte has brought this Saharan art to the world's attention. The beautifully drawn herds and herders, bird-headed goddesses, the hunters dressed in animal heads and tails, people of Negroid type, claims Lotte, were painting men and women with a beautiful and sensitive realism before 3000 BC, and were among the originators of of naturalistic human portraiture. Pottery is now known to have been made by black Africans as early as 7000 BC in a fishing hunting community near Khartoum. The people of this community fired pottery and combed it with a catfish spine to give it a basket effect. The oldest ivory figurines found in ancient Egypt were sculpted by the Badari, a Negroid race of the Egyptians. Another form of art found among the Egyptians, which came up from the Sudan and points to a domestication of cattle as early as 4500 BC by black Africans, are the rock paintings of cattle with intricately twisted horns. The fanciful shapes of these horns reappear in the temple and tomb paintings of dynastic Egypt. Discoveries of this nature are of the greatest significance. They give the lie to the Hamitic hypothesis, which made claims still believed by many historians of Africa that pastoral science, the skills of cattle rearing, came into Africa through Caucasoid Hamites. Thus, C.G. Seligman, the most bigoted and influential British exponent of this racial theory, stated in a book originally published in 1930 and reprinted without change as late as 1966 that, quote, the incoming Hamites were pastoral Europeans, arriving wave after wave, quicker witted than the dark agricultural Negroes, end quote. The earliest agricultural settlement in the Negro Sudan, that of the Fayum, shows that pastoral and agricultural science existed side by side. British archaeologist A.J. Arkell excavated two sides along the Nile, one near Khartoum, south of Egypt, where the Nile splits, and one in the Fayum area. In the Fayum site, there was clear evidence that people were growing grain and minding cattle as early as 4500 BC, while in the Khartoum site, the blacks were cultivating crops and making pottery. Arkell found something even more interesting, something that connected these two sites to an African source west of the Nile, deep in the Sahara. In both sites were considerable quantities of Amazon stone beads, microline feldspar, from the Eygpt Mountains north of Tibet in the Sahara. In the Khartoum site was found dotted wavy line pottery identical with pottery in the Tibet area. What this indicates is that Tibet was a dispersal area of cultural influences moving up the Nile from the Sahara, and that when that desert, once a fertile plain, ended its wet phase and began to dry up, black Africans started moving north and east, following the shrinking tributaries of the Nile until they reached the floodplain, thereby colonizing Egypt. Every new archaeological find seems to be pushing the agricultural breakthrough in Africa further and further back in time, and the influence of this breakthrough on the ancient Egyptians should not be underestimated, since the great and early civilizations were built only after mankind had reached the settled agricultural stage. It has been assumed that Africans were late in the day in this respect, and since the Asian agricultural complex was among the earliest, the agricultural science of Egypt was thought to be largely Asian in origin. The American anthropologist George Peter Murdoch has reclassified the great agricultural complexes in the ancient world: the Southwest Asian complex, Caucasoid; the Southeast Asian complex, Mongoloid; the Middle American complex, American Indian; and the Sudanic complex, West African. The Sudanic complex was completely ignored until recently. Russian botanist Vavilov, who listed all plants in the three non-African complexes, never visited Black Africa. Hence, he and others made serious misclassifications, especially with regard to indigenous African crops that had traveled to India and were thought to have originated in Asia. Murdoch, by use of geographical and linguistic distribution of plants and plant names, as well as recent agricultural finds, has been able to prepare a classification of plants belonging to the Sudanic complex. He has shown that the Mande people of West Africa created a center of plant domestication around the headwaters of the river Niger, circa 4500 BC. He has also shown that while Egypt gave nothing in the way of plants to Black Africa, Black Africans contributed the bottle gourd, the watermelon, the tamarind fruit, and cultivated cotton to Egypt. Murdoch's claim that crops move north and east across the African continent from this center of plant domestication in the western Sudan is borne out by a study of Nubian agriculture. Nubia, the black state on the southern boundaries of Egypt, in spite of its long passage under the dynastic Egyptians, has little in the way of crops that it owes to Egypt. Its basic crops were Sudanic in origin. It seems, whatever the reason, that whereas West African crops traveled up the Nile and took root in Egypt and its colonial outposts, Egyptian crops are not to be seen in sites west and south of the Nile. In one of the fire holes of the 4500 BC settlement near Khartoum, excavated by Arkell, the charred fragment of an oil palm fruit, an indigenous West African plant, was found located far north and east of its original home, the agricultural complex of the nuclear Mande. Moving in an Egyptian direction, no comparable find indicating the southward or westward movement of an indigenous Egyptian plant exists. C. Wrigley is critical of specific points in the Murdoch thesis, but concludes nonetheless that plant domestication must have occurred very early in Africa. He argues that the existence of wide networks of languages which are only remotely related, fine pottery dating back to 5000 BC in East Africa, and livestock in the eastern Sudan in 4000 BC attest to an equally early emergence of food producers in sub-Saharan Africa. Roland Porteres presents as evidence of ancient African agriculture the fact that India, as early as 1300 BC, had imported a number of indigenous African crops. Botanist Edgar Anderson, operating by wholly different methods and using different evidence, arrives at roughly the same conclusion as Murdoch. He agrees that there was a separate African origin of agriculture around the headwaters of the Niger. The investigations of Delcroix and Vaufry provide archaeological support for this hypothesis of an early independent center of agricultural domestication in West Africa. Among the numerous archaeological materials that they have studied from the West and Central Africa, they identify the Tumbien of Guinea and the Paratumbien of the neighboring Sudan as the remains of early simple agriculturalists. Carl Schwerin suggests that the Tumbien culture began somewhere close to 5000 BC. Radiocarbon dates for these sites have not yet been attained, but Professor Davies has provided radiocarbon dates for later sites in the Niger area, which, while not as early as the Arkell dates in the Sudan, show that the general consensus among these botanists, archaeologists, and anthropologists has a basis in fact. For the Tenere Neolithic, a later agricultural phase in the Niger, he gives a date of 5140 BC, plus or minus 170 years. As I have indicated before, the drying up of the Sahara pushed black Africans northward up from the central Sahara and the Sudan toward the Nile floodplain. This they occupied in fairly dense concentrations in the pre-dynastic period. It is this northern migration of the black African into the basin of the Nile that made the land of Kem, Egypt, essentially an African colonization. Thus, the blacks in the pre-dynastic period hugging the banks of the Nile were responsible for major agricultural innovations along that ancient river. The blacks dominated a land from the 29th parallel north to the 10th parallel south by circa 3400 BC. This land was the old Ethiopian Empire. In the north, from above the 29th parallel to the Mediterranean, there was a slice of land, 1/4 of Lower Egypt, into which Asians and a sprinkle of Caucasians trickled. These foreigners waged wars with black Africans until the Africans won a decisive victory over them circa 3400 BC under the African king Menes. It is from this point that real Egyptian history begins, because it was then that the African king joined the two lands, Uazit with Neghebit. Negheb was the old black capital. It is at this point too that the winged disc motif developed as a political symbol signifying the unification of the two lands. Menes laid the foundation of a city which was to become the capital of the Egyptian kings for 3,000 years, named after him. During one of the longest reigns in history, Menes brought about the kind of stability that not only provided a solid foundation for a first dynasty, but also the economic and social conditions necessary for a far more uniform expansion of religion, the arts and crafts, and the mathematical sciences. Here too is where Mesopotamia, Palestine, and Greece, although not as advanced, may have made cultural contributions to the Africans and received much from them in return. The unification of the lands led to the mixing of Asians and Africans in the north. The African script, language, the character of the royal dynasties became a composite of African and Asian elements. In other words, Lower Egypt, the north, became physically and culturally a, quote, mulatto Egypt. Asians married African princesses, and the integration of the two peoples proceeded apace. Hence, the emergence of pharaohs with both Negroid and Asian physical characteristics. Some of the royal portraits and sculptures are highly stylized, with the headgear, the false beards, etc., often obscuring the racial detail. It is often necessary to look at other royal representations of the same period to fully appreciate this. But conventional historians have ignored the African beginnings, the African political and administrative structure, the unique African form of the divine king concept, the African agricultural contribution on the Nile, the African science of mathematics and mummification, all the elements that laid the basis for the first four dynasties. They make no mention of the fact that the Sphinx was a portrait statue of the black pharaoh Khafre, also called Sephron, nor that the greatest of all the pyramids was built during the reign of the African Khufu, 2nd dynasty 2590 to 2567 BC. nor that the religious cults of Seth and Ammon were African. They bypassed all the Negro African figures in the dynasties or disguised them with blanket classifications, laying emphasis only on the Asian elements, the men who came in from the north as tent-dwelling nomads. They credit all the genius of the dynastic period to these infiltrators, inheritors of an African cultural, scientific, and even physical legacy. When the blacks are mentioned at all, they are confined to the 25th dynasty, which is called the, quote, the Ethiopian dynasty, end quote. Even that, as we shall show in our next chapter, has been in dispute until recently, and when it was not contained within a footnote, it was classified in such a way as to render it insignificant and unworthy of serious consideration. Labels like, quote, period of decline, end quote, are clapped onto these periods. Inscriptions are defaced, Negro African heads are lopped off, noses are chiseled down, photographs are taken from misleading angles or through misleading filters. Nomenclatures meant to confuse are pasted over the archaeological and documentary evidence. One comes upon the scene of history as though a witness to a massive cultural genocide, the perpetrators of which have nevertheless left telltale clues in the graveyard, where a subterranean current and electric truth galvanizes still the surviving skeletons and sculptures. A largely mixed North, Afro-Asian mulattoes, and a largely black South, Negro-African, sums up the racial picture of Egypt, from about 3000 BC down to the period just before the birth of Christ. In all her periods of upheaval, when the North was threatened by chaos or the invasion of foreigners, Egypt was rescued and reunited by powerful men from the black South. When it fell into anarchy during the latter years of Pepi II and was divided into feudal baronies during what is known as the First Intermediate Period, 2200 to 2050 BC, a Nubian southerner, Mentuhotep I, reunited Egypt. When in 1770 BC the North was invaded and conquered by the Hyksos, an Asiatic people, the black South remained strong and took into its arms the fleeing mulattoes from the North, transfusing a new stream of Negro African blood into the mixed pool of the northern Egyptians. When in the 25th dynasty, 800 to 654 BC, the Assyrians, the power of Western Asia, had made vassals of the northern Egyptian kings, it was the black kings of the south who reunified Egypt under their rule once again and held the Assyrians at bay for nearly a century, ushering a renaissance, not a decline, of the Egyptian culture and spirit. It is important to understand that modern Egypt and modern Egyptians are not the direct successors of these ancient peoples. With the fall of Egyptian civilization in the last phase of the pre-Christian era and the massive Arab movement into the north, the sack of Alexandria and the founding of Cairo, northern Egypt and indeed all northern Africa changed in its physical and cultural appearance. It is to the last great phase of Egyptian history before this radical change begins that we shall now turn our attention. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8. The Black Kings of the 25th Dynasty. As one gathers eggs that have been abandoned in fright, have I gathered the whole earth. Sennacherib, the Assyrian king. And then he, Sennacherib, heard say of Tirhaka, king of Ethiopia, behold, he is come out to fight against thee. Book 2, Kings, chapter 19, verse 9. At the far end of the Dongola Reach. As the Nile bends and swings upward, streaming north toward the Fourth Cataract, it flows through the province of Napata, where in the towns of Kuru and of Nori lie the ancient graves of kings. These are the graves of the forgotten kings of Kush, the black Valhalla, through whose ghostly fields may still be heard the distant din of wars, the clash of Nubian and Libyan, of Nubian and Assyrian, over the ailing body of Egypt. Here lay, in their trappings of silver and bronze, the mummified horses of Pianki, Shabaka, Shabataka, and Taharka, or Tirha-Ka. Here lay the black princes of the 25th Dynasty, who from circa 751 to 654 BC threw their shadow across the length and breadth of the Egyptian Empire, from the shores of the Mediterranean to the borders of modern Ethiopia, almost a quarter of the African continent. They were among the last of the great sun kings of the ancient world. These kings formed the last bastion of ancient Egyptian civilization against the advance of the alien. Black Nubian troops of Kush not only brought Osorkon III, a Libyan king of Upper Egypt, to his knees, but crushed the rebellion of the petty kings of Egypt under Tafnak, and, seizing power over both Lower and Upper Egypt, rescued it from vassalage to the Assyrians, holding that great power at bay for nearly a century until they were eventually outclassed by the heavier concentration of iron weaponry in the Assyrian forces. For one brief century they restored Egypt to her former glory, renovated her temples, and gave new life and moral authority to the sun god Amun-Ra, who had become in that time the chief god among both Nubians and Egyptians. In the towns of Kuru and Nori lie the graves of these ancient kings. At the foot of the pure mountain, Jebel Barkal, in the temple of Amun, lay many of their weapons and jewels, statues and stelae. Their graves, though plundered, their mummies, though stolen, their stelae, though partially defaced, give proof, nonetheless, of their true ancestry and origin. Why then are they not represented as black, or, even when so conceded, relegated to a footnote in the conventional histories of the ancient world? We have seen the attempts to deny black Africa's contribution to the rise of civilization in ancient Egypt. It was difficult for Europeans during the era of the African's enslavement, when the myth of his fundamental inferiority made his subjugation easier to carry on the Christian conscience, to admit that he once stood on the upper branches in the tree of world civilization. But the seeds black Africa planted, which cross-pollinated with those of the mixed Mediterranean races meeting on the Nile, flowered into that tree under whose branches and feeding on whose fruit Greece, Rome, and Britain later grew. As in the beginning, so in the last great phase of the Egyptian world, the black African gained ascendancy. To see him in this light, as a power in the dawn and in the sunset of ancient Egypt, was anathema to the ruling prejudices of imperial scholars. Thus, Reisner and Bruch Bey, Drayton, Van Dier, and Moray, to mention just a few, and even more recently Arkell and Sheney, seek to bypass the blackness of these kings. Dr. Brooks Bay, in his book A History of Egypt Under the Pharaohs, published nearly 100 years ago, advanced the theory that the kings of the black lands of Nubia and Kush, who rose to power in the 8th and 7th centuries BC, were not really black at all, but came from outside to give leadership and guidance to, quote, these imperfectly developed people, end quote. He claimed, and later Triton and Vandier supported the claim, that the royal family of Kush were descended from a certain high priest of Thebes, Herhor. This Herhor, also spelled Herihor, had been the founder of the 21st dynasty. He had seized the Egyptian throne in 945 BC and made himself the first prophet of Ammon. But his successors, after 150 years of rule, were eventually overthrown and forced to flee Egypt sometime around 800 BC. It was around this time that a great national passion was stirring in Nubia. Nubia, in which was based the kingdom of Kush, which was later to expand and embrace the whole Egyptian world, had already begun to feel her native strength, to assert her national independence. Egyptianized though she was in many respects from long colonization, she had gained self-government during the troubled period through which Egypt was passing. Yet these scholars would have us believe that at the crest of this spirit of self-pride and national ambition, the black Nubians, credited at that time with having the finest militia in Africa, without a murmur of protest, with not the slightest show of resistance, allowed the fleeing priests of the house of Herhor, men who had lost all power and prestige, impotent, defeated refugees, to establish a new domination over them. Brooks Bay reveals the racial attitude behind this absurd suggestion when he speaks of Nubia and Ethiopia as places, quote, where the minds of an imperfectly developed people must needs show themselves pliable and submissive to a dominant priest caste, end quote. The only thread of evidence for the theory presented by these historians was the fact that Pianki, the first important king of the 25th dynasty, had adopted a name which was the same as that used by his son and successor of Herhor. Pianki is Egyptian for the living one, and considering the number of Egyptian customs, names, and religious rituals surviving among the ex-colonials, it was flimsy evidence indeed. Excavations in 1919 by G. A. Reisner, which led to the discovery of the graves of the kings, put an end to this hypothesis. The evidence of the graves made it clear that the kings of Kush could not have been native Egyptians, but Reisner then advanced a new and equally misleading theory. After a cursory examination of stone arrowheads, which he found in several of the graves at Kuru, he decided that some with recessed bases were of Libyan type. With this preconceived notion of a Libyan link, he was led into the misreading of a word on the stele of Queen Tabiri, one of Pianki's queens, as Temehu. This word means southern Libyans, and he therefore thought she was, quote, great chieftainess of the Temehu, end quote. On this slender evidence, he concluded that, quote, while the northern Libyans were entering the delta or soon after, the southern Libyans, the Temehu, pushed into the Nile Valley, end quote. Reisner then began to invent a Libyan chief who settled at Kuru and whose family, according to him, obtained the domination of Ethiopia. A.J. Arkell, in A History of the Sudan, dismisses this in one sentence, which was all it really needed. The evidence for this, he declares, is, quote, non-existent, The theory, however, gained ground for many years, and in several histories of Egypt, such as Alexander Moray's The Nile and Egyptian Civilization, the kings of Kush are represented as Libyans, although placed in the confusing category Ethiopian dynasty. I say confusing, for the word Ethiopian was used in a very general way in ancient times. Ethiops, literally burnt face, was a broad catch-all word for dark people. That was why Peter Martyr referred to the mysterious blacks Balboa came upon in the Isthmus of Darien as Ethiopians. It is also confusing if we think of Ethiopian as an exclusive referent to the people of modern Abyssinia. The Ethiopian dynasty, a label given by the Egyptian historian Manetho to the Black Power period of Egypt, is really the dynasty founded by the kings of Kush, with its base at Napata in Nubia. The old notion that the ancestors of the Kushite royal family were Libyans has been abandoned. Most modern authorities now agree that they were of native Nubian origin. The way they were buried is one of the several clues to their native roots. The burial practices are not only non-Egyptian but also very different from anything found among the Libyans. In spite of the Egyptian cultural influence, and the graves of the kings give clear evidence of this, the manner of the royal burial is distinctive. The black kings are buried on beds rather than in coffins. A coffin bench is constructed with niches cut out of near its corners for the legs of the funerary bed, the frame of which rested on the bench. In one of the queen's tombs, 2 bronze bed legs were found still in place. This type of burial was practiced by the Nubians 1,000 years earlier. While the furnishing and iconography of the royal tombs in most respects followed the standard Egyptian practice of the period, they, the kings of Kush, were reluctant to abandon their ancestral form of burial. What is even more interesting is that we find close by the royal burials the graves of people who worked under the black kings: priests, artists, craftsmen, scribes, some of whom were Egyptian, buried in the Egyptian fashion, bodies in coffins without beds. These graves of typically Egyptian style belong to people of lower status than the kings. The pits where these bodies lie are much narrower and very poorly furnished. Another difference between Egyptian burial and that of the black kings of Kush should be noted. The mound form a superstructure which occurs in the royal graves at Kuru had been characteristic of Lower Nubia since 2000 BC. This evidence has convinced Professors Arkell and Shinney, as indeed it would convince anyone who has had to examine it, that the chieftains of Kush were native. But having come step by step through each archaeological advance to an admission that natives, not foreigners, provided the power behind the kingdom of Kush, we find that the question dramatically shifts from what is the racial origin of the kings of Kush to what is the racial origin of the natives of Kush. This, says Arkell, contradicting his earlier clarity and certainty on other related matters, is, quote, wrapped in obscurity, end quote. His pupil and protege, P.L. Shinney, is equally cautious. The result should be treated with reserve, he declares. When faced with the findings of excavators at Karanog that clearly indicated that the overwhelming majority of skeletons in the Nubian area during this period were Negroid, we are witnessing again the same Negrophobia that afflicted so many European scholars during the heyday of the Hamitic hypothesis. That myth has now been bludgeoned to death, but its mutilated ghost still lingers, particularly within the unconscious racial reflex of British scholars. When the Nubians were paying tribute and bearing gifts to the pharaohs, there was no doubt whatever as to their racial identity. Their blackness was not, quote, wrapped in obscurity. There is a representation of Negro Nubian princes in an Egyptian wall painting in the tomb of Hai at Thebes. This painting has been well circulated. It appears in countless histories of Egypt and owes its popularity to the fact that it flatters the generally accepted notion of the black as colonial or vassal. Little or no use is made of equally instructive paintings of ancient Egypt in which the Caucasoid or Asiatic figure is depicted as bound, captive, and slave. The Nubian princes are seen in the painting sitting in ox-drawn chariots shaded by parasols. Both they and their attendants are predominantly Negroid. Why then should skeletal surveys, which show the natives of this area to be predominantly Negroid, be treated with reserve? Has the Nubian become faintly Negroid, to use Shinny's shamefaced phrase? As he leaves the role of vassal behind him and aggressively assumes the double crown of Egypt. Both Arkell and Shinny seek to deny the Negroness of the Nubian king Taharka. Arkell says that, quote, it is most improbable that Taharka was a Negro, though he may have had some Negroid blood in his veins, end quote. Fortunately, we do not have to depend on these gentlemen for proof on the point. We can go to the records of Taharka's enemies themselves, the Assyrians, his contemporaries who on several occasions, both in times of troubled peace and on the brutal field of war, met him and his predecessors face to face. They left a vivid portrait of Taharka, who haunted their sleep as they had haunted the sleep of the Egyptians for generations. They met his predecessor, Shabaka, brother of Pianki, when their ambassadors came to hold peace talks between him and the Assyrian king Sennacherib. Impressions of Shabaka's clay seal have been found side by side with that of Sennacherib in the royal archives of Kunulik and Nineveh. They saw Taharka for the first time when, circa 701 BC, he appeared as a young man on the battlefield near Jerusalem, coming to the aid of Hezekiah of Judah. Taharka's appearance on the field of battle is mentioned in the Hebrew chronicles of that period. He was not yet king, but he had been sent out to head the Nubian contingent of the allied Nubian-Egyptian army in preference to his elder but weaker brothers. The Assyrians clashed with him again in the Delta in 673 BC, when he repulsed the forces of their king Esarhaddon, and at Memphis in 671 BC when Esarhaddon drove him south. They faced him finally in 666 BC when he regrouped his forces, reoccupied Upper Egypt, and forced Esarhaddon's son Ashur-bani-pal to march on him once more. Taharka was routed and retreated further south, but maintained control of Upper Egypt and Nubia until 663 BC, when, in the last year of his life, he began to share his throne with a nephew, Tanu Tatman. Kings like Taharka would appear in the van of their forces, riding on swift chariots. He made a spectacular sight. His horses were brilliantly caparisoned. The Nubian kings of Kush made a fetish out of horses. They were buried alongside the royal families, even as the earlier Egyptian pharaohs had buried their favorite Basenji dogs. To see the black king Taharka galloping across the battlefields of Jerusalem, at Tunis in the Delta, and in the sacred city of Thebes was never to forget him. The people of Judah saw him and took heart when Hezekiah was wavering in his mind as to whether he should submit to the Assyrian Sennacherib or lean on Egypt for support. The Assyrians have immortalized him. Esarhaddon had a portrait of him carved upon a stele at Sinjirli, which clearly represents him as Negroid. Arkell says that they depicted him thus to show their, quote, Oriental contempt, end quote. Forgetting that this would have been an anachronistic pathology in that period, J. H. Breasted, in his History of Egypt, points out, quote, "He was the son of a Nubian woman, and his features, as preserved in contemporary sculptures, show unmistakable Negroid characteristics." An outline of events in the eastern Mediterranean during the reign of these black kings is of great significance in the matter we are examining. It may help to illuminate the state of the time and reveal to us the nature of the pressures as well as capacities within the Nubian Egyptian world, which led to the embarkation of a ship or ships down the Mediterranean toward North Africa circa 800 to 671 BC. A ship or ships carrying Nubian troops in command, one or two Phoenician navigators or merchantmen, and a crew of craftsmen and peasants of both Negroid and mixed Egyptian ancestry, including a few women. The motives for this journey, which never got to the place intended but left indisputable traces at its point of destination, will become obvious as a historical outline of the period unfolds. Nubia had been moving toward her independence since the 10th century BC, but it was not until some time between 800 and 750 BC, when, taking advantage of the schisms within Egypt, a royal house founded at Napata threw up a king who felt strong enough to extend his power over the south of Egypt, that is, Upper Egypt. This was Kashta. He pushed the Libyan king Osorkon III out of the south and made himself master of the gold mines and the Nubian militia. Pianki, 751 to 716 BC, the son of Kashta, pushed further north into Egypt. Egypt in his reign became a shuttlecock between the Assyrian kings of Western Asia and the black kings of Nubia. Lower Egypt, north, was not occupied by Assyrian forces, but its kings paid tribute to the Assyrians and acted as their vassals. Upper Egypt, south, was solidly within the black sphere of power. Middle Egypt, like a kind of no man's land, vacillated between both powers, now playing to the Assyrians, now to the blacks as power shifted. The Assyrians were like a great deepening shadow upon the horizon of the Middle East. They were the Huns or Hitlers of that era. They had invaded Iraq, Iran, the Hittite country, and Syria. The Assyrian king Sargon marched into Samaria and transported the Jews in chains from Israel to Iraq. The world was at war. The Asiatics were moving their iron-powered army into the Mediterranean and Africa, but the Assyrians had bitten off more than they could chew. While they had made vassals of many of the native Egyptian kings of the north, they had to be content with merely seeking tribute. They were too tied up, holding their ground elsewhere, to occupy and consolidate their hold on Lower Egypt, the northern provinces. Sensing the Assyrian weakness, a local petty king, Tafnak, prince of Sais, a district in the north, rebelled and started to take control of Lower Egypt, forcing allegiance from the other petty kings. But Tafnak did not stop at usurping Assyrian power. He reversed the gains of Pianki and made the kings who paid the black king tribute dogs at his feet. It was at this point that the battles which were to lead to the total conquest of Egypt by the blacks began. Naval engagements were fought on the Nile. Sieges were laid to Egyptian cities. Tafnak was pushed back and back and back, his vassals submitting one by one until Pianki, like the great pharaohs before him, donned the double serpent crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. In the last great battle of the campaign, At the siege of Memphis, the Black King marshaled every kind of watercraft, barges, passenger ships, cargo vessels, using the yard arms as bridges and ladders to scale the walls. Tafnak was forced to retreat to an island within the northern reaches of the Nile. Battles in themselves may be quite meaningless, victories ephemeral and hollow, but something had begun to happen here that gave relative stability in spite of the fighting that was still to follow, to the Black Dynasty that was emerging. Pianki, like his father, established unswerving obedience to his command by both the Nubians and native Egyptians through his fanatic devotion to the god Amun-Ra at Thebes. He baptized his vast army in the river before proceeding into battle, in a time of chaos and disorder when Egypt was indeed like a bruised reed. The kings of Cush introduced or reinforced the practice of direct divine intervention into the state of affairs, turning Amun-Ra into an oracle so that their orders seemed to come straight from the mouth of God, thereby establishing divine sanction for their dynasty. The statue of Amun was jointed, a priest being especially appointed to work it, and in the sanctuary's hiding places were arranged in the thickness of the wall, from which an officiant skillfully caused the oracular voice of the god to be heard. The Black Kings inspired a renaissance of the classical Egyptian spirit. They renovated the temples. They restored royal mummification and pyramid building, which had lapsed for generations. Though they built only one kind of pyramid, the truncated step pyramid, they even restored the concept of solar blood, whereas Egyptian pharaohs had abandoned this custom and had begun marrying Mitannian wives from the hither Asia. The Nubians reinstituted royal incest to preserve the line of the sons of the sun god. Nubia behaved in some ways toward Egypt as America toward Britain, finding herself 200 years after independence the chrysalis of an empire in her own right, powerful and free, yet striving, however awkwardly, sometimes with a naive idealism, to enshrine and preserve the traditions she has inherited, and which, through military might, she alone is equipped to defend and protect, becoming in effect a keeper and conscience of her former lord. Nubia, through Pianki, and after him Miamam-Nut, who fought with Tafnak's son, Bokoris, and after him Shabaka, who burnt Bokoris alive, and after him Shebitku, who passed over all his brothers for the strongest, Taharka, who had already proven his courage in the van of the allied Nubian Egyptian forces in Jerusalem. All these men fought in an unsettled time in a divided world to weld Egypt once more into a unity by virtue of unifying religious faith. They were all distinguished, in spite of their warlike reigns, by the zeal and piety of men who honestly believe they are agents of a spiritual power. The double serpent motif dominated the dream life of these kings, and such dreams are described in the stelae of King Nut and King Tamen, a son of Shebitku, Taharka's elder brother, and Qualhata, Taharka's sister. These dreams gave them a single-minded intensity, a sense of mission, of destiny. Thus did their followers fight as fanatically, pursue their enemies as relentlessly, kill with as great a sense of Puritan sanctity as did the Christians and Muslims in the later eras of their holy wars. No petty Egyptian king like Tafnak or Bokoris could arrogate himself the divine titles which these black kings, through their pious dedication to Amun, commanded and assumed. All factions fell, therefore, before the holy march. City after city bowed down in fear and trembling before the messengers of Amun, until from the northernmost head of the Mediterranean down to the southern juncture of the Nile where she splits, branching wide her white and blue legs, the body of the Egyptian empire submitted to the kings of Cush. The Assyrians continued to threaten Egypt. They saw the northern provinces fall into the hands of Cush, but even while the battles raged, they seemed unable to take advantage of Egypt's internal upheaval and attack her. They too were embroiled on many fronts and dared not overreach themselves, preferring to consolidate their power in Western Asia before risking another naked confrontation with such a powerful adversary. Many years passed before the inevitable happened. The blacks instituted a policy of détente with Assyria. King Shabaka, Pianki's brother, came to some understanding with the Assyrian king Sennacherib. Like America and Russia, each decided to observe or pretend to observe the other's military and political fief or sphere of influence. Like the modern great powers, they also tried to avert the inevitable clash as long as possible, while conspiring secretly to undermine the other through its satellites, and occasionally fighting limited wars not on their ground but on satellite battlefields. Hence Taharka's appearance on behalf of Hezekiah at Jerusalem. How the battle for the little state of Judah might have ended had it not been for the mysterious epidemic that broke out among the Assyrians, no one can tell. The Assyrians were not to meet the blacks face to face again on the field of battle for 30 years. Thus their Cold War lasted roughly as long as ours has so far. But Taharka was not idle in those years. He left Upper Egypt, the southern lands, in charge of the black Sudanese high priest Mentuhemet. Then Taharka came up north to Tanis in the delta and established his palace in Lower Egypt, where he could be in the swim of things, sensitive to all that was happening in the Mediterranean and Western Asia. He became king in 688 BC, and while playing the policy of détente, conspired with the Phoenicians in Tyre and Sidon against the common enemy, the Assyrians. The Phoenicians at that time were vassals of Assyria. They were a defeated but rebellious people, paying tribute to their masters but quietly plotting revenge. So dangerous was the conspiracy they hatched with Taharka that when at last it was discovered, the Assyrians unleashed massive and brutal retaliation against both Phoenicia and Egypt. The Phoenician king of Sidon was executed. An insurrection in Tyre, which broke out soon after, was savagely put down. The Cold War between Egypt and Assyria came to an end. Esarhaddon, the son of Sennacherib, marched into Egypt and met Taharka's army at Memphis in 671 BC. The relationship between the blacks and the Phoenicians and their common interest in the face of the Assyrians is an important factor in this period. It may help to explain how a Mediterranean figure with flowing beard and turned-up shoes appears in association with the Negroid figures in ancient Mexico and certain elements of Phoenician artifacts, such as a model of the Phoenician god Melkart, have been unearthed in America in archaeological context related to the African-Egyptian presence. Egypt had been trading with Phoenicians for centuries. These people had once been nomads of the desert but had eventually settled on islands in the Mediterranean. They were, however, a people with nomadic urges and soon made of the sea what they had once made of the desert, a field for their restless wanderings. They were extremely poor in metals and so depended for these on their maritime trade, going to Hattus, a Hittite seaport, or to an island later called Cyprus for copper, to the Iberian Peninsula for silver, also to Egypt for the same and Nubian gold dust, and as far as Cornwall and the British Isles, right out into the North Atlantic for their tin. Although their boats were smaller than those of the Egyptian, 70 feet long was the average, they were extremely maneuverable and equipped with both oar and sail. From their native islands, they carried linen cloth and wool, fine jewelry, cedar, from which some Egyptian ships were made, perfume and spices, and from their major seaports, Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, things that were rare and treasured in the ancient world. A purple dye, which came to be known as Tyrian purple, and was reserved as the color of royalty in the Mediterranean, exquisite glass from Sidon, papyrus from Byblos, which the Egyptians used to write their very first books. Yet compared to the Egyptians, the Phoenicians were semi-illiterates and have left very few written records. Some scholars have claimed it was not so much a matter of their literacy as a reluctance to put things down, a secretiveness about their markets, sea routes, and navigational science. They were always afraid of losing their advantage at sea, for this was their only strength. In spite of their restless energy and enterprise, they were a very vulnerable people. They lay within the valley of the giants and became the vassals of many powers, Egyptians, Assyrians, Persians, etc. But the Egyptians, Herodotus tells us, even when they made subjects of the Phoenicians, did not stifle their maritime trade. It was as vital to Egypt as it was to them. The more riches they amassed from this trade, the more tribute they could pay to Egypt. The practical wisdom of this laissez-faire policy toward the Phoenicians appealed to the Assyrians also, and so it was that they gave military protection to the Phoenician caravans on land, while allowing them to move freely at sea. From one end of the Mediterranean to the other, although they were a subject race, a lot of Egyptian trade was carried on in Phoenician ships. The Phoenicians were, although merchants in their own right, often mercenary seamen of the Egyptians. As late as circa 600 BC, when Assyrian power had waned and the Phoenicians were once more under the heel of the Egyptians, the pharaoh Necho II hired them to circle Africa by ship. In the era of Nubian domination of Egypt, vast supplies of copper and tin were required to provide bronze weaponry for the armies. Phoenicians, as poor in metals as Egypt, made fortunes out of the maritime metal trade. There was something even more important and urgent about the search for metal supplies in this period. The Bronze Age was coming to an end. The Age of Iron had been ushered in swiftly and terribly by the march of the Assyrians, whose armies owed their superiority to a heavier concentration of iron weaponry. The blacks of Kush had learned of the process of iron smelting, but Egypt was poor in iron. Taharqa is credited in the history of the Sudan with having introduced the ironworks in Nubia at a place called Meroe, but this was after his retreat from Egypt. The sites of the blacks in this period of their ascendancy lay in the north, where they could realize their dreams of dominating Egypt, not in the south, their homeland, until their armies were irrevocably pushed back by the Assyrians. The discovery of iron, therefore, in their own heartland and in considerable quality did not come until around 650 BC, when it was too late to make any real difference in the military struggles. The techniques of iron smelting were not the monopoly of the Assyrians. These techniques had been developed among the Hittites before their conquest by the Assyrians, and may have diffused to Egypt and Nubia through Hittite refugees fleeing their bases in the Mediterranean as the great armies of the alien overpowered them. The Hittites fled also to Phoenicia. They became a dispersed people, settling in tiny pockets in Egypt, Phoenicia, and elsewhere, intermarrying with and becoming incorporated into the culture of their neighbors. Thus, we have a picture of the culture complex of this period and the pressures which made it necessary for Taharqa to intrigue with the Phoenicians under the noses of the Assyrians. It is during this period that we find at La Venta, in the Gulf of Mexico, a complex of figures that were associated in the Nubian, Egyptian, Mediterranean milieu of that period. Four massive Negroid stone heads, an Egyptian-type helmets, and a Mediterranean-type figure standing beside them, carved out on a stele, with a flowing beard, Semitic nose, and turned-up shoes. Phoenician merchant captain? Also, we find overwhelming evidence of African-Egyptian cultural features, some of which had lapsed in Egypt for centuries but enjoyed a revival in the Nubian period. Features which had a long and complex evolution in the Mediterranean but seem to have emerged full-born with no archaeological layer of antecedents in the American world. We are later to find bits and pieces dispersing from this initial point of contact, a model of the Phoenician god Melkart in Rio Balsas. Mexico, identification of Hittite glyphs on obsidian disc or coins by Mrs. Verrill in the state of Utah, but also in the most remarkable of combinations and in one single place, a number of reliefs of Negroid dancers side by side with reliefs in Assyrian style, which style was introduced among the Nubian Egyptian models of gods at Thebes by Taharka's black deputy in the south, Mentu Emhat, a representation of the god Ra in its bird aspect, and a sculpture of the Egyptian Sphinx. These were found in a single spot at Monte Alban in the first phase of that civilization, which evolved from the last phase of the Olmec world. What an apparently incongruous combination of elements: Negro, Nubian, Egyptian, Assyrian. We can see quite clearly from our outline of history how natural to that period was such a cultural fusion. But it led Egon Kisch, a German journalist, to cry out in rhetorical despair, quote, "Is there any other spot on earth so completely enwrapped in darkness, so mute in the face of all our questions? What tribe, what race, once dwelt at the foot of Monte Alban? Who were the builders, who were the architects of these pagan temples? What were the tools of the stonemasons made of? How to explain why several of the urn figures seem to depict an Egyptian sphinx, another the bird-headed god Ra, and why the reliefs in the gallery of the dancers are partly in Assyrian style, partly the portrayal of Negroid types? How? Why? Whence? These elements in combination suggest a crew with Nubian Egyptian troops in command, a navigator of Phoenician ancestry, probably a Hittite or two, a number of Egyptian assistants, such as attended the black kings at Thebes and Memphis, a number of women, like the black Egyptian woman from the pre-classic era of American terracottas, whose resemblance to the Negroid queen Tai, Professor von Wuthenau has remarked on. This was a crew that set out on an important mission, therefore was a fair representative or cultural microcosm of the society and place from which it embarked. Did this ship or ships set out to seek iron ore deposits along the vast iron shield of Africa, or other conventional metals, all of which, because of the war, were sorely needed, and got lost by force or storm or treacherous current on the North Atlantic? Or was it a flotilla of refugees fleeing the wrath of the Assyrian Esarhaddon after the discovery of the Nubian Phoenician conspiracy? The quest for metals is the most likely and logical of all possible explanations, for refugees of Phoenicia had no need to flee beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The Assyrians lacked the capacity to pursue them to the western extremity of the Mediterranean. Furthermore, Taharka, facing the first full-scale assault of the Assyrians, would never have committed his badly needed troops to the protection of Phoenicians retreating into the distance of an unknown land. The quest for metals, however, could easily have taken them out into the Atlantic, since it had already taken them to quarry the tin stone of Cornwall. This need for metals transcended all other needs. What oil and uranium are to us today, so was iron to the survival of the Egyptian empire in that time. Iron was to change the world. Egypt's inability to redeem her lack of it was the largest single cause of her defeat. Taharka and his successor fought, fell back, regrouped, and fought again. But the initiative had been lost. The doom of an iron-poor Egypt was imminent. The Bronze Age was over, and with it, Egypt's position of preeminence in the ancient world. End of chapter 8.